Hi, my name is Eden Wolde. I am an undergraduate student at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, within the College of Education, and I'm interviewing Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings. And today we're going to be discussing things from her book, The Dream Keepers, and also just her scholarship and her perspectives on the current climate of education.
Okay.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being able to be in space with me. My first question is, with your influential work with the Dream Keepers, successful teachers of African American children, do you think the field has implemented your literature into practice?
Well, I think there's always going to be a theory-practice divide. You can never totally make that a seamless transition. I think the work that I've talked about, the work I've done and written and published about all these years is in the lexicon. Whether or not there is true fidelity to what I wrote and what people are doing, I have no control over. And so certainly I can show you examples of teachers who have really taken up the work and implemented it. And I can also show you examples of people who say they're doing it, but what you actually see them doing is very different from what I laid out.
And why do you think there's that dichotomy with how it's being implemented? Is it from the teacher education programs? Is it just from misconceptions about the work that you kind of provided us in the literature?
I think it's some of all of that. You know, it's really hard for a practitioner to know what's in the mind of a theoretician, which is why I tried to give as many concrete examples of this is what this looks like in the field. But everyone has to adapt it for their own specific context. You know, take the example of a great cook who writes a cookbook. The recipe is there. All of the ingredients are there. Then you might ask, well, why didn't the cake come out the way it looks in the picture? Well, part of it is technique, part of it is misinterpretation. You will never know exactly why what was laid out in theory doesn't look that way in practice.
And so for both emerging educators and educators in the field, how can we bridge that gap in our own professional development so we are actually enacting the theory into practice in an accurate way?
Well, I think a big part of that is trying to figure out where do you want to end up. I think we're so preoccupied with how do I start that we don't ask the bigger question, what do I want it to look like when I'm done, all right? So that kind of back mapping that, you know, I want kids to know and be able to do certain things academically. I want kids to understand their own culture and at least be fluent in a culture beyond themselves. I want kids to have a kind of critical consciousness that lets them ask important questions about the world in which they live and the problems that they're trying to solve. That's the end point. Now, what it looks like along the way may be very, very different based on teachers' skills, teachers' own ability, the youngsters that are in the classrooms that they are serving.
And as I was preparing for this interview, I found out that you were discussing post-pandemic pedagogy. And as an emerging educator myself, getting into the field, I wonder how to deal with the new climate that I'm entering in, just from past the pandemic, with no kind of experience being before the pandemic. So could you kind of elaborate on that post-pandemic pedagogy?
So I think there is a tendency for us as a culture to want to, quote, get back to normal. One of the things I'm pushing back against is that, because there were so many things about normal that were problematic. So if we go back to normal, what are you saying? Well, we want to go back to a place where the same kids get misidentified and pushed into special education. Are you saying that you want to get back to a place where the same kids never have an opportunity to take an advanced placement course or an honors course? If we get back to normal, are you saying what we want is for the same group of kids to be constantly suspended and expelled from schools? I want us to move away from that as our normal.
And so what does the post-pandemic pedagogy look like?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. want to tell you as much as I can without giving my whole speech, right? But I think we've actually learned some things from the COVID pandemic. Number one, we learned that relationships matter. That when schools closed down, kids didn't miss getting reading packets or math packets. They missed relationships, whether it was with peers or with caring adults. So if that matters, what are we going to do post the pandemic to enhance relationships? Okay, so that would be one thing that we could do. We could say, all right, we're not just going to treat every kid exactly the same. We're going to be intentional about the relationships. One of the things that I've been working with teachers on is what Christopher Emden from Teachers College calls radical welcoming. In other words, how do I make you know that I'm really glad you're here? Or am I just going to open the door because the bell has rung and now it's time for you to come in? Or are you excited about being here because of the way I welcome you here? So that relationships matter is one thing we learned. I think a second thing we learned is that time is fungible. You know, one of the things that happened in the remote learning and in the using of the technologies to instruct youngsters is that it all doesn't have to get done by 3 in the afternoon. Or we learn, for example, that teenagers are not upset because you want to meet in the evening. You know, 7 p.m. is not a hard time for teenagers. It's 7 a.m. that's the problem, right? So now that we know time is fungible, should we then be rethinking credit hours? Are we only focused on how much time you spent, or are we going to be able to focus on the competencies that you achieved? I think a third thing that we learned is that the technologies now have to move to the center. Before the pandemic, most teachers used technology in the ways that were very much like electronic workbooks, or at the administrative level, we treated it like whenever there's a problem with I can't get my email up, or our website is not working, call those people to fix this, as opposed to having educational technology folks in the room with us when we're making curricular decisions, when we're saying, well, what is the best way to organize, say, a physics course? How can the technology help us with that? The technology should be helping us in terms of academics, in terms of administration, and things like grading and attendance taking, and communication. Because even when people lose everything, house, car, job, one of the things they hold on to is their cell phone. So even if you go to a shelter where people are unhoused, most of them have a cell phone. Are we maximizing the fact that almost everybody's walking around with that device as a way to communicate to parents? So again, that relationships matter, that the time is fungible, that the technology has to move to the center. One of the arguments I've been making is that because of the technology, nobody ever has to be absent again. Why? Because we could be recording and archiving what we are teaching. And when kids show up, we can say, hey, check the course website. You can see what you missed yesterday. And then I think the final thing that the pandemic taught us very much in our face was that schools have to begin to really understand that they serve the personal needs, basic needs of students and their families. In most districts, when schools shut down, the first thing they did was to begin to get food out to those families. Food, not textbooks, not course assignments, food, a very basic need. And so it is a question of making sure that kids are fed, clothing, a lot of kids don't have the proper clothing, and so then they don't come to school because it's too cold and I don't have a jacket, or I don't have gloves, or I don't have clean clothes. And kids will make fun of me, so I'm not going to come. Schools now are doing all of these services, and I think that in some ways the pandemic, I think we kind of knew it, But I think the pandemic has underscored it for us, and we could be very different kinds of institutions and organizations if we began to pick up on what we learned in the midst of this.
Thank you for that answer. You mentioned Chris Emdin and integrating much more in honor of like your work about culturally relevant pedagogy. And so you said back in 2015 in a speech that you believe that it's controversial to say that hip hop can be the most important cultural vehicle for connecting with new century students. Mm-hmm. Now in 2023, it seems so embedded in our culture. And so do you think that hip hop has been embedded into our teaching practices as well?
No, it has not. That's the short answer. Mm-hmm. I think the more complex answer is that many of our teachers are operating in a very different environment and world than the students they serve. So probably a question that will come up in my presentation tomorrow will be something like, how many of you are on TikTok? When I ask that question, in most teacher education environments, the number is very low. Mm-hmm. Oh, I don't want to be involved with that mess. No, I don't want to do that. But the truth of the matter is, your students are there. It's not so much that you have to post something. You don't have to be out dancing on TikTok. But do you know what's out there and what information students are receiving? So it was the same with hip-hop. Mm-hmm. Hip-hop is so much a part of everyday culture for most of our youngsters. If we don't at least know about it and what's going on there, how do we then incorporate it into the way in which we're teaching? You know, we have kids who will tell you to your face, I hate poetry, but that same kid has a big composition book full of rhymes because he doesn't understand that what he's doing is poetic. Mm-hmm. And we haven't made the connection. And, you know, for those people who would argue, well, we don't want to go down that road and, you know, that is, quote, from the street or, you know, we don't want to do that. I challenge them because those very same people will spend close to a mortgage payment to go see Hamilton. Okay? So here on the one hand, you have this sense of this is what's, quote, high culture, but it is what's coming from streets and communities that is infused in these and is informing our culture. And it's always been that way. Shakespeare himself was considered low culture during his time.
Mm-hmm. Now I'm thinking about, as someone that is currently in a teacher education program, I'm wondering why there is that disconnect on how to kind of integrate youth experience, youth culture into our teaching. And whenever I think about that, I think that like our courses kind of just teach us what we need to know or what is the data say, and not really think about what is happening in our classrooms and also who's in our classrooms. And so what do you say for emerging educators that are trying to be respectful to the literature, to the research, but also be proactive in their teaching and who they're teaching?
So the demand on teachers is very heavy because teaching is a state function. Mm. So there are state standards, there are state frameworks, there are approved curricula on the one hand, and then there is the reality of the school that you're serving, the community you serve, the students who sit in those communities. So often I'll try to give students a fairly simplistic analogy so that they can understand what I'm trying to get them to think about. So here's my analogy. Before I had my first child, I read all of these baby books, right? Because, come on, Dr. Spock knows. Mm-hmm. T. Barry Brazelton knows. These folks are pediatricians and they're renowned in the field. But then I have a baby that shows up that doesn't know anything about Dr. Spock or T. Barry Brazelton and doesn't care about them. Mm-hmm. So I've got a theory over here, but I have the reality of this kid. Now, am I just going to stick with what the book says, or am I going to attend to the needs of the youngster who is right here in front of me? Mm. which may be very different from what's being talked about in the aggregate in these textbooks and in the research. That's the sort of smart piece of it. Go back to the cooking metaphor, right? That the recipe says this, but it's got an ingredient that you know your family just won't, they're not going to eat that. So you have to make those adjustments based on who you're trying to serve.
I also do wonder, as a Black educator coming into the field, I wonder with your work about culturally relevant pedagogy, it's often presented to me sometimes white-centered, that white teachers need to become culturally relevant teachers. But I wonder, does culturally relevant pedagogy go both ways? How can teachers of color, teachers from ethnic and racial and religious backgrounds also become culturally relevant as well?
Well, and I think what you're hitting on is one of the major problems in teacher education, and that is a misunderstanding of culture. See, culture cannot be reduced to race. Culture is, there are at least 50 different definitions that anthropologists accept for culture. One of the ones I love best is very simple. It says, culture is what feels good and makes sense. So that's going to be different in different settings. So as much travel as I've engaged in, as many places as I've lived, I still have to learn the culture of wherever I am. Even if all the people look like me, it doesn't mean that we are practicing the culture in the same way. And so we want to embed the culture in the individual, and that's just not true. Individuals engage in cultural practices. There are some parts of the culture we embrace, and there are other parts that we go, no, I'm not doing that, right? So the sense that because you are a part of a particular culture, that you have access to all aspects of it is ridiculous. That's not true for anybody. So the process of teaching and learning always involves this constant reiteration, this constant learning, this constant going back. I could go back to every school I've ever taught in and I'd still have to relearn something because things have changed. Times have changed. People's experiences with the culture have changed. So culturally relevant pedagogy was never meant to just focus on one group of people. It was always to elevate culture as a part of teacher preparation. It is absent in most teacher education programs. It's still absent some 25, 30 years since publishing this work. Most teacher education programs have programs around child development or adolescent development or ed psych. They may have a history of ed course. They may have a school and society or sociology of it. They rarely have a culture or anthropology of education or a culture program. Now, people will say, oh, but we have the diversity course. No, that's not about culture. That's about the other. And that's keeping a certain race, class, gender, sexuality normalized, and then we need to learn about those, quote, other people. But learning about culture, and I say this often, my heaviest lift teaching in a place like Wisconsin is helping my students understand they have culture, because they don't think they do. Their response to me is, we're just normal. So when one centers oneself, no matter what that race or ethnicity is, they don't really understand that culture's informing their understanding of themselves.
And with the teacher education programs, why do you think that is not as prominent, or really that culturally relevant pedagogy and multicultural education are more buzzwords than actual integrated ideas?
I think part of it is about timing. We've had teacher education for a very long time. We're just catching up to culture as a significant part. It's sort of like when you talk about, what's the dominant idea in a society. When I'm in the UK, people scratch their heads over race. They say, well, we don't have racial problems. Now, I can identify them for them, but they'll say, no. Our problems are around class. In the US, we pretend like we don't have class differences. And we get mad when people identify them and, oh, you're trying to foment class warfare. There's always been class differences. So culture has kind of just lurked well beneath the surface of any of our discussions because we presume, oh, we're all part of this American culture. So culture wars are often about trying to elaborate, trying to extend, trying to explore different ways of what it means to be American, and there are people who will push back against that. So it ends up with us having no conversation about culture.
Thank you. I also do wonder about your conceptualization of education debt, especially for Black and Brown students. And I wonder, do you think that the field has moved the needle in kind of rectifying or even bridging that debt?
I think I put that concept out into the literature in 2006. It actually comes on the heels of my presidency of the American Educational Research Association. And I was grappling with a way to think about how do we get everyone invested in dealing with the disparities that exist in our schools. Most of the literature is shaped in such a way that it presumes, I'm not saying this is what's in people's hearts or minds when they did this work, but it lays out a kind of sense of what's going on in our schools as if there are some kids who are doing just fine, and then these kids who are, quote, lagging behind are part of what was called an achievement gap. And it didn't take into consideration that school is not the only place where disparities exist, that there are gaps in our health system, there are gaps in employment, there's gaps in wealth. So to lay all of it on, quote, education, to me was disingenuous. So I was looking for some language that could recruit more people into thinking about, well, okay, what's my part in this? Where do I get to participate in helping this to alleviate these disparities? So it was about the debt language, and I can't even remember if I wrote it in the paper or not, but I know I said to people, what made me think of it was me sitting in a taxi cab on my way to LaGuardia Airport in New York City. And if you've spent any time in New York City, you know you are sitting. You're not riding, you're sitting. So I'm sitting in the cab, stuck in traffic, and I look out and see a bulletin board in which there's this huge number on the board. And I think about that time it was close to $11 trillion. Now it's over 13 trillion. But it was $11 trillion, and the caption said, "This is the national debt." And the numbers are spinning, so it's not a static number. It's like every few seconds, the debt is increasing. And then underneath was a smaller number. Still a big number, but a much smaller number. And that smaller number caption said, "And this is your portion of it." And I'm sitting in the cab going, well, I can't pay that, you know?
Right.
And I asked myself, why did I feel obligated? Because essentially what that bulletin board was trying to signal is that we are all contributing to the debt based on the kind of goods and services we want, the kinds of programs we insist on, the way our military is funded, the entitlement programs for our seniors, all of that is adding to it. So you're adding to it right along with it. And then I noticed that when you hear discussions in both the U.S. Congress or in various states, there'd be this discussion about we cannot saddle our young people with this debt. I mean, that's a line that plays across the aisle. We can't keep putting this debt on our young people. And I thought, okay, that's a wonderful metaphor. Now, instead of just keeping it at the metaphoric level, I went and sat with some colleagues in my economics department and had them explain to me how the debt functions, and could there be such a thing as an education debt? And they literally showed me, the numbers. This is how much we are losing in the society because we're not educating this group of people. This is what's happening. And it was fascinating to me. So I think the language has probably made it into the discussion. Whether or not we've decided to do anything about it, and it really is a sort of systemic issue, I don't think that's there yet.
Okay. And so with a follow-up, I want to know what do you want us to kind of do as a course of action to ensure that the youth, the students, especially Black students who are highlighted in your book, The Dream Keepers, are being supported in their learning and are moving past these stereotypes and actually achieving the way they should achieve, and also find joy in their learning amidst it all?
Well, I don't think our young people can either find joy or really be truly learning until they have a good understanding of the problems that they are facing. And so a big part of the work of culturally relevant pedagogy is helping kids become very critical, to have them ask, well, why is this way? Why is it that when our basketball team goes across town to play that suburban high school, that they have state-of-the-art locker rooms, that they've got, a scoreboard that lights up, and we barely have a facility. That's a legitimate question that we want youngsters to ask. When we don't help them to begin to ask those questions, they begin to assume they deserve what they got. What's wrong with us becomes the question. And I want them to ask, what's wrong with the society that decides some young people are worth more? There is something like a $10,000 per pupil per year differential in kids in some of our major cities versus their suburban counterparts. That's a legitimate question. Why is that kid out there worth $10,000 more than I am? And when you begin to sort of do that digging to ask those questions, then you can begin to say, okay, well, this is what I probably need to do. This is the person I need to write a letter to or make a call to, or these are the causes that we need to support. I'm going to be on social media for more than showing you my latest hairstyle or my new fit. I'm going to get on social media and talk about these differences, so that we begin to have a real deliberative conversation.
I appreciate that you're kind of positioning students to become their own knowledge producers, and also start to understand their context, but also kind of like freedom dream a new type of learning and new type of future for themselves. And so to kind of close it out, I wonder, because I know the Dream Keepers is like kind of like a honor to Langston Hughes, and so I want to know, as you are very distinguished throughout your entire career, what is a dream that you've kept going throughout this entire time? And do you think that dream is coming into fruition?
Well, thank you for being probably the first person who has acknowledged that I brought that from Langston Hughes.
No, I did my little research, yes.
But, I'm someone who really became the culmination of my ancestors' dreams. I know, for example, that I'm only 4 generations out of chattel slavery. My great-great-grandmother, actually my great-great-great-grandmother, Lena Cooks, was enslaved. My great-great-grandmother, Laura Trapp, was at the tail end of slavery and into sharecropping. My grandmother, Cora Lyles, was a sharecropper, which is just another form of slavery because you never really get ahead in it. My own mother had to endure legal apartheid, state-sponsored segregation. She could not try a hat on in a downtown department store. So for them to produce someone who ends up being an endowed distinguished chair, That long view is important to me, that I know that I'm their dream. So the question for me then becomes, what does this mean for my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren? You know, what's my legacy? What is it that I can actually look forward to? So my dream is that we continue to move forward towards this incredible dream of democracy.
Thank you. I appreciate you. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.